Greetings and welcome to another Bible study in which we gain new perspectives on the sacred writings. Chapter 22 of Genesis gives us one of the most famous stories of Abraham, but also one of the most troubling. Rabbis, scholars, theologians, and philosophers have puzzled over these passages for centuries. Now, while most would see this act of Abraham as one of faith, the philosopher Immanuel Kant famously said that he believed that Abraham's willingness to follow God in this was actually morally offensive, because God would never ask someone to do something that was morally wrong. And modern ethics and morality would probably agree with him. So what is going on in the story, and what can we learn from it? And so let's take no more time, but jump right into this sacred text. And so we pray that the Lord will make himself known as we read the sacred word. Some time after these events, God put Abraham to the test. He called to him, "Abraham." "Ready," he replied. Then God said, "Take your son Isaac, your only one, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah. There you shall offer him up as a holocaust on a height that I will point out to you." Early the next morning, Abraham saddled his donkey, took with him his son Isaac, and 2 of his servants as well, and with the wood that he had cut for the holocaust, set out for the place of which God had told him. On the 3rd day, Abraham got sight of the place from afar. Then he said to his servants, "Both of you stay here with the donkey, while the boy and I go on over yonder. We will worship and then come back to you." Thereupon Abraham took the wood for the holocaust and laid it on his son Isaac's shoulders, while he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the 2 walked on together, Isaac spoke to his father Abraham. "Father," he said. "Yes, son," he replied. Isaac continued, "Here are the fire and the wood, but where is the sheep for the holocaust?" "Son," Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the sheep for the holocaust." Then the 2 continued going forward. When they came to the place of which God had told him, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. Next, he tied up his son Isaac and put him on top of the wood on the altar. Then he reached out and took the knife to slaughter his son. But the Lord's messenger called to him from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham." "Yes, Lord," he answered. "Do not lay your hand on the boy," said the messenger. "Do not do the least thing to him. I know now how devoted you are to God, since you did not withhold from me your own beloved son." As Abraham looked about, he spied a ram caught by its horns in the thicket. So he went and took the ram and offered it up as a holocaust in place of his son. Abraham named the site Yahweh Yireh. Hence people now say, "On the mountain the Lord will see." Again, the Lord's messenger called to Abraham from heaven and said, "I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you acted as you did in not withholding from me your beloved son, I will bless you abundantly and make your descendants as countless as the stars of the sky and the sands of the seashore. Your descendants shall take possession of the gates of their enemies. And in your descendants all the nations of the earth shall find blessing. All this because you obeyed my command." Abraham then returned to his servants, and they set out together for Beersheba, where Abraham made his home. There is much to reflect on from these passages that we have just heard, and certainly more than one theological layer to its meaning. So first we will look at it from the historical and theological context as it sits within the book of Genesis. How might it have resonated with the original audience? Of course, there's also a Christian interpretation of this story, and so we'll go back and look at it once again with that in mind. And so let us look at it again, verse by verse. So at any point, does God really want Abraham to kill his own son? And the answer would be no. And this first verse tells us that God put him to the test, showing that this whole thing was a test for Abraham. And Abraham's response, in many translations, is simply, "Here I am," which is a phrase that we'll see very often in the scriptures, which basically shows a person's familiarity with the Lord and their willingness to do what is asked of them. And this familiarity with God gives us a little hint as to why Abraham was willing to go through with this. God refers to Isaac as your only son, the one whom you love. Now, of course, we know that Abraham had 2 sons, Ishmael and Isaac. And yet in the last chapter, Abraham sends away Hagar and Ishmael. And so legally, he really only has 1 son. And of course, it would be the son who would go on to inherit the promise that God had given him. Now, God also knows Abraham's heart, and he knows that Isaac is his favored son, the one that he had with his wife, Sarah. And then God tells him to go onto the heights of Moriah. For those unfamiliar, Moriah is the mountain where King David will buy a threshing floor and build an altar to God. It would then be the place where King Solomon builds the temple. Yes, that temple. In other words, Moriah would be the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. This is significant because the sacrifice of Isaac foreshadows the holy city and most honored place of ritual sacrifice. The rock around which the temple was built is believed to be the place where Isaac was bound, and later believed to be where Muhammad, the founder of Islam, ascended into heaven, and serves as the name of the current structure, the Dome of the Rock, which, of course, is a Muslim holy site. Back to the story. God tells Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, his only son, as a burnt offering, as a holocaust, which would have been okay for crops or animals, but certainly not for humans. Now, human sacrifice may have been practiced by the Egyptians and some of the other tribes that Abraham would have had contact with, but it was certainly not something that he was familiar with. And so what must have been going through his mind? How could God, who had promised him this son for decades, he was finally here, now telling him to sacrifice him? Well, let's step back for a moment and try to see this from Abraham's perspective. He was the first one to really have a relationship with God, and so he was still trying to figure it out. This is before really Judaism was a word. This was before there was a sense of community or faith or people that he could talk to about this. It was just him, and God was telling him something. And he knew who God was. He had had a relationship with God. He'd walked with God. He even had a meal with God. And so here, God is telling him to do something. Abraham has no question that this is God speaking to him, and he's still trying to figure this out. And for him, morality meant doing what God says. It wasn't about doing what he said. When he tried that, him and Sarah usually got into trouble. And so it was all about, if God says this, this is something that I need to do. And from that perspective, we can understand a little bit more why Abraham was willing to do this, even though it must have been tearing at his heart. The next morning, they set out on their journey. We are told that Abraham takes his donkey, his 2 servants, and of course his son Isaac. He also brings the wood that would be used for the offering. And this really sets up the tension of the story as they begin this journey. It also seems odd that Abraham does not question God. He does not speak up, which Abraham really does have a habit of doing. Remember, he even argued for the people of Sodom as he was trying to protect his nephew Lot. And yet here with his own son, he remains silent, seemingly just willing to go with what God asks of him. And so we continue with the story as they walk, mostly in silence, on this journey. It would have been about a 3-day journey from Beersheba to Jerusalem. And this, of course, works out because 3 is one of those significant numbers in the Bible. And it's a number that we will see come up again as we continue to look at this story. And then Abraham leaves his donkey with his servants, and him and Isaac go on to the place that God has indicated to them. It is interesting that he tells his servants that they are going off to worship, and then they will return. For Abraham, this offering is still an act of worship. He has not lost faith. And so it says he takes the boy or lad with him. And so which begs the question of how old Isaac was during this time. And I always pictured him as being a boy or a young teenager. And yet with a quick search of various Bible commentaries, it seems that he could have been anywhere from the age of 12 to 37, assuming that this was a time before his mother Sarah had died. The Bible really doesn't give us any indication of how old he is other than calling him a na'ar, or youth. It is also interesting that Abraham tells the servants that we will return. So of course he's keeping him in the dark about the sacrifice he is about to do. But also Abraham may have in his heart this feeling that perhaps he won't have to sacrifice his son. And either way, it does serve as a bit of prophecy as to what will actually happen. The next 2 verses that we're looking at really go together as the focus turns to Isaac, as he has this conversation with his father. And this is really heartbreaking because it is the first time we see this interaction between Abraham and Isaac. And it echoes the interactions between God and Abraham as he says, "Here I am." And so we can imagine that Abraham is kind of torn out of his thought, whatever was going through his mind as they're walking together. And Isaac asks him, where are we going to get the sacrifice? And so we can wonder, how much does Isaac realize about what is about to happen at this point? I mean, Isaac, as a teenager or as a young man, certainly would have been able to overpower his father, who was well over 100 at this point. And yet, he still continues to walk with him. And this sense that they walk together really, again, brings us to this idea of when Abraham walked with God. In response to his question, Abraham tells Isaac that God will provide the sheep or the ram for the offering. And this, of course, has a couple of meanings. God did indeed provide Isaac, as he allowed Abraham and Sarah to finally have this son. But also, Abraham may be acknowledging that he secretly hopes that God will give him an out of the situation and provide another offering for him. And this does foreshadow exactly what will happen. And here we are told step by step what Abraham does as he prepares for the sacrifice. He lifts up his son onto the altar. He binds him. He prepares for the sacrifice. And Isaac does not resist. He allows him to do these things. Now, typically with a sacrifice, Abraham would have to kill the animal first and then would light the fire for the Holocaust. And Abraham takes out his knife and he is prepared to go through with this act. And of course, the angel of the Lord comes down and stops Abraham right at this minute, saying that he has proven his faith and reverence for God by his willingness to go through with the sacrifice. And of course, this angel's message also for future generation serves as a prohibition against any type of human sacrifice. Just as Abraham had predicted, God does provide another sacrifice in the form of a ram that was caught in the thicket. So Abraham quickly goes out and grabs this animal, and this is what they use for their sacrifice. Again, allowing them to continue this act of worship to God. And as is typical in many of these narratives, the name of the place corresponds to what had happened, in this case meaning the Lord will provide, or could also be translated as the Lord will see. And we also see that Moriah is a play on the word to see. The angel of the Lord then speaks to Abraham again by swearing on himself. And now you can't get much more serious than swearing on God, especially if you are God. And so what does he say? Basically that, again, Abraham did not withhold his son from him, and therefore showed his righteousness. He showed his faith. And so what is it that God swears or promises? Well, it's the same promise that he's been giving Abraham all this time. And it's interesting that this final promise, the final time that God says this, is also the seventh time. And so we see God giving him the perfect promise, because Abraham passed the final test. And God is saying, once again, that his descendants will be like the stars of the sky, the sands of the sea, and not only that, but they will defeat all of the enemies before them. And so it is that twofold promise of his descendants and of him inheriting the land. Finally, after this last theophany, which Isaac would have been a witness to, they return to their servants, and then they return home to Beersheba. Now, as we've been looking at these passages, some of you may have seen another layer, particularly from the Christian point of view. And so we're going to go back and once again look at them with this in mind. For those wondering about whether or not God would put us to the test, we are told in the Gospels that God sent Jesus to the desert specifically to be tested before his ministry. Also, in the prayer that the Lord taught his disciples, it asks that God not put us to the test, which signifies that God indeed does, as uncomfortable as it might be. The other layer in this account is, of course, seeing Abraham and Isaac as a foreshadowing of God and his only son, Jesus. But more than a foreshadowing, often the prophets are instructed to act out God's message in order to emphasize God's very real relationship with the people, where the prophet acts in the part of God. For example, Hosea is told to marry a harlot to symbolize God's relationship with Israel. Yeah, let that sink in for a minute. In this case, we focus on the offering of the beloved son. It is also significant that this takes place on the heights of Moriah. Jesus will be crucified on a hill right outside the walls of Jerusalem, which would also be considered the heights of Moriah. In the Gospel, Jesus enters into Jerusalem on a donkey, not with his servants, but with his disciples, those who call him Master, and sets out for the place where he will make the final covenant with them. The third day is mentioned. In Hebrews, the author states that Abraham believed that even if he sacrificed Isaac, God would have the power to bring him back from the dead. For Christians, the third day is a reference to the resurrection of Jesus. The meaning here is the same. Offering and worship go hand in hand. This is also a reference to the resurrection, when Abraham assures them that we will come back. In the predictions of his death in the Gospels, Jesus tells his disciples that they will not see him, and then they will. The wood for the offering was laid on Isaac. Yes, the son carried the wood to the place where he was to be sacrificed. just as Jesus would be made to carry the wood of the cross for his execution. Isaac is concerned and calls on his father, Abba, as he questions him about the sacrifice. When Jesus is in Gethsemane, which would be in the same area, he calls out to God, saying, Abba, for his heart is troubled about his upcoming sacrifice, and he questions God, yet also resigns himself to his suffering and death. God will provide the offering. This can certainly be seen as a prophecy for the mystery of Christ. God provides the ultimate sacrifice, as John the Baptizer called him, the Lamb of God. Isaac is bound and prepared for the sacrifice, just as Jesus was bound and led away. Yet he did not resist or cry out. Like Isaac, he was willing to go through with it. Here's where the narrative changes, because Abraham is stopped by God. However, this points to another truth. We see that a ram is then provided by God to take the place of the one who was to be sacrificed. In Christian theology, the one who deserves death is us. Humanity has repeatedly turned away from God, and we should be the ones on the altar, or the cross. Yet instead, God provides the lamb. We are spared. God sees our goodness as he created us and provides us an offering in place of us, his beloved Son. In the promise to Abraham, the Lord tells him that all the nations of the earth will find blessing through him. This is what happens through the blood of the cross. The mission of the disciples of Jesus would be to not only go to the house of Israel, but to proclaim God's salvation to all nations. Isaac lives, and on the third day, Jesus rises from the dead. Just as this moment signaled the ratification of the covenant between God and Abraham and his descendants, the paschal mystery of Jesus establishes a new covenant with all people. It should be no wonder now that three major world religions trace their heritage back to Abraham: Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. His unwavering faith in God laid the foundation that gives us a model of such a unique relationship with God. It is also significant that the promise on Moriah includes all nations, which we will not see in many of the covenants between God and the nation of Israel. But what can we learn from this faith of Abraham? Is it even possible? As mentioned earlier, the morality of Abraham was much different than we understand it today. And I don't think that's a bad thing. In fact, today, if someone were to come up to me and tell me that God was telling them to sacrifice their son, I would probably think that they were crazy. And I would probably be right. Today, God would not ask us to do something that is that morally offensive or that we know to be wrong. But why would he ask that of Abraham? Well, for one, and forgive me, Abraham, but he simply didn't have the context that we have today. God was testing him because he knew that was something that Abraham saw in the world around him. And he knew that that was the one thing that Abraham was holding on to. And so God still tests us today, but he asks us things according to where we're at in our own life and what we understand to be right, the things maybe that we are holding on to that we don't want to let go of. And so a sacrifice for us today will look very different than it did for Abraham. God certainly still asks us to sacrifice certain things in our life, but our understanding of what those things might be will depend heavily upon our own faith and experience. The faith of Abraham allowed him to be willing to give up the thing, in this case a person that he loved the most. That was the most important part of his life. To have faith like Abraham means the willingness to do the same. It may be a person, a thing, a dream, a particular way of life. We might ask ourselves, what gets in the way of me following the Lord? As a wise Jedi once said,
train yourself to let go of everything you fear to lose.
Especially of the thing that we are most afraid to lose. In the beginning of our story, we talked about Abraham's life from the time he left his father's house as a hero's journey. For a modern understanding of the hero's journey, Joseph Campbell's The Power of Myth offers a great perspective. Of course, we see this in many popular novels, like The Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter, or in movies like Star Wars, the original trilogy. The hero, in order to become the person he or she was meant to be, must not only leave home, but must be tested. Without being tested and challenged, without letting go of something important, they cannot truly grow. Typically, they are defeated the first time they encounter a test or challenge, but ultimately gain wisdom, usually with the help of a wise mentor, and are able to triumph. Abraham finally passed the test. He did not hesitate. He did not question. I believe that we are all tested in our lives and have to make challenging decisions. In order to succeed, we might ask ourselves, where have we failed? Who are our mentors? What training have we endured? What have we given up? To have the faith of Abraham is not a timid response. It takes a lifetime of training as well as courage. Abraham was over 100 years old, after all, when he finally passed the test. Thank you for sticking with me today as we have continued to hear about Abraham's journey. And for us that are parents, this may have been a difficult story to hear, and one that is often difficult to really get behind. But it does show us the challenge of faith, and that it can be a very difficult thing indeed. And so next time, please join me as we continue to hear really about the end of Abraham's life, particularly as he mourns the death of his wife, Sarah. And so, thank you again, and until next time, continue on your own hero's journey, and do good.